Okay, so here we are on the Eastern Front. I'm just going to run through an example of play in terms of the ground combat. So if we start just by having a quick look at the sequence of play, you start a monthly turn with the weather phase. We're going to be considering good weather, so we don't need to roll for the effects on aircraft. After the weather phase, you resolve strategic warfare in terms of strategic bombing, Axis air interdiction, then the Axis surface raiders, followed by U-boat operations, and then any iron ore interdiction. Following the strategic warfare, we move on to the naval and air phase, which starts with a first naval movement step, and essentially the play with the initiative will decide who moves the first naval task force, and they then alternate, and then you get on to the air movement steps, of which there are two. Again, the side with the initiative decides who gets to move first, and they do all their air movement. So that's different from the naval step. And but what wasn't clear, obviously in the rules as they were originally written, was that all air units from both sides do return to base after each air movement step. It doesn't matter whether it's the Axis or the Allied. Then we finally disembark any supply into ports. They're on transports, and then we move on to the offensive phase, which is where we are now. So the side with the initiative goes first, and the side with the initiative is the one that purchased the most number of offensives for the season. So we're going to say that the Axis forces, their combined Italian and German offensives were greater than the Allied. In the case of a tie, you resolve it with a die roll. And you're allowed land, naval or air offensives, or indeed joint offensives, which can combine two of those three. But here we're just going to do a land offensive. So the first thing you need to do is to activate units which you want to take part in the offensive, and you subtract an offensive from your track where you keep tally of them. And the first thing you do is activate either a stack, which means that stack can move. So I could activate these two 6-3 infantry corps. I could move with them, and I could make one attack with the stack. Not very efficient. The other type of command agent, as it's called, it could be a leader. So we've got Manteuffel here, who's stacked with the two units. So I could do a leader offensive, where he would activate, and units adjacent to him would also activate and could take part in the offensive, and they could launch one attack. But the most common and the most effective type of offensive is the HQ. So here we've got Army Group North. It would cost me one offensive to activate it, flip it over, and it can activate units within its radius of 4 hexes. The 2 refers to the number of attacks it can make during each of the breakthrough, normal combat and exploitation steps. Right, so having activated the HQ, you then confirm which units are active. So 1, 2, 3, 4 up to here can be activated. You can also move the HQ 3 hexes and activate more units after that. So let's just stick him here. So we've now activated pretty much everything that you can now see on the map. And then we get onto the breakthrough step. Now for breakthrough, you don't need a leader, but you must have mechanized or armoured forces whose movement factor is circled. So here we've got 2 Panzer divisions with Manteuffel, and there's also 2 up here. So either of those 2 stacks could actually be activated for breakthrough combat, and they are moved and they attack individually. So the objective for the Germans on this part of the front is to capture the city of Voronezh. You can see Voronezh there. It's a city, it's also a resource objective, so a good target for the Germans to try and capture during this operation. So they could decline to do any breakthrough combats. If you do a breakthrough combat, you're not allowed to also exploit afterwards. It's either or. But the Germans really want to get over the river here, so they can attack Voronezh from two sides and get a concentric attack for a +1 modifier. So what they're going to try and do is they're going to try and crack the river line. This is the Don actually, and they'll do a breakthrough combat with Manteuffel and the 2 Panzer divisions. So you start by doing breakthrough movement, which can be up to 2 hexes, and you could move from Zock to Zock once if you had to. Here we don't have to. So for example, I could do a breakthrough combat move and move to there and then launch my breakthrough combat from that position. But the Russians have got a front line along the river. So they announced that they're going to do a breakthrough combat into this hex, and there are two Russian corps in there, and the Germans have got these forces as part of the combat. Attacking across the river, the ground units are halved, so we've only got 10, half of the 20. The leaders themselves have a combat value, which is the number on the left, and this adds on to the halved value. It's not halved itself, so the total strength here is actually 14 against 8. So really we'd like to get to at least 16, and if we can we'd like to get to 24, so we can get 3 to 1. Let's have a quick look at the CRT, and you can see the CRT there is 2 to 1's probably as low as you want to go in terms of odds. There will be hopefully air superiority for an additional +1. So if you can get to 2 to 1 with additional +1, you're looking at a 5 or more having potential success. Of course 3 to 1 would be even better. So let's see what we can do in terms of supporting this this ground combat. Well, the Germans are going to try and get to 24, that's the objective. And over here they've got 2 Heinkels, probably the best of the German bombers potentially, and the range of 12, combat support of 6. They're going to fly these 2 into the hex, and what you do is you put a currently committed marker on the airbase where they came from. I usually rotate mine a little bit if they're committed in the current phase. It's just from a previous phase where I would have straightened up the CC marker. So now I've got 24, 26. However, the Russians don't like that very much. They've got a couple of Yak 1s within 3 hexes. Interception range for fighters is 4 hexes, or half of the range, whichever is the greater. The range being the number on the right, and the air quality of these guys is 2. So the first one's going to fly towards the combat hex, and when it gets to the adjacent hex, doesn't matter which way it goes in, so it goes in this way. We've got a couple of 109s on this airbase. Now they can sort of counter intercept, because that's 1, 2, 3, 4 away, and they're going to do that before the Russian fighter gets to the target hex. So that's placed on there, but it's not resolved yet. And then the Russians can say, well, I'm not done yet, I'm going to commit a second fighter. In it comes. Now the Germans have got a decision to make here. They could intercept this one before it gets there. The problem is that with the air-to-air combat, a 6 is always a miss. So there is a chance that one of these two Yak 1s will slip through the fighter screen and get to the bombers, which would be almost defenceless. So for the 2 rounds of combat, those Russian fighters would be allowed to take part in both rounds, which could see off both of the bombers. So these guys are going to hang back and allow the fighters to enter the hex, at which point they'll announce the interception. And we've also got some 110 fighter bombers, which are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 away. Now, whether they're intercepting or not, it doesn't matter. They can use their full range of 7, because the target hex is the land combat hex, so they can use their full 7 hex range. And in they go. So what I tend to do is I tend to spread these out like this. Here we are, and I mark the combat hex with a little tile spacer, so I know when the bombers return I'm going back from that space. So we have to resolve this combat first, because if the Russians are successful, they may be able to continue with their movement and join the combat. So how you work at air combat is, you take your strength, 4 for the 109s, add the quality, 3, 7, subtract the quality of the target, 2, so their targets are 5, and similarly for the Russians we've got 4 plus 2, which is 6, minus the 3 quality of the German fighter, that becomes a 3. Then you roll a d6. A 6 is always a miss, even if you had a quality of 4, so your strength was 8 and you were minus 1 with an 8, a 6 is always a miss, no matter what. And a 5 is always an abort. A 1 is always a hit, unless it would just be an abort. So we'll roll a couple of those. Red for the Russians, white for the German. We've got a 1-4, so you can see that the 1 is indeed a hit and abort, whereas the 4 from the Russian is a miss. So we don't have 2 rounds of combat, we have 1 round of combat. These guys stay aloft for the moment. Because the Russian was killed over friendly territory, you'll be able to use pilot recovery and get that step back at the end of the monthly turn, rather than having to wait for the seasonal turn to rebuild. But job done for those 109s. Now we go to the combat target hex. Here are the 2 111s. The Yaks are going to target one of those. And now the Germans have got a chance of having, they can either decide to drop the ordnance with the 110s and become a fighter, and then they can double team the interceptors, or they can keep the ordnance and try and contribute 4 to the combat, and they know that the 4 plus the 6 is 10, which puts them on 24, which is one of the options. So they're going to keep the ordnance and rely on these guys to see off the interceptors. So the first round of combat is, we have the 4 plus 2 for the interceptors, 0 for the bomber, target of 6, that's a 4, so these guys hit and abort, they're going home. Then we've got the 4 and the 3 minus the 2, we get an additional +1 because this fighter is attacking a fighter that's attacking a bomber, so these guys have a slight advantage. Doesn't matter so much here because we're already on the maximum, where a 5 would be an abort. If we'd have used the 110s, then that 4 would have become a 5, +1 would have been a 6, minus 2 would be 4. So it would have helped the 110s, but they're concentrating on dropping bombs. So we roll. Oh dear, we've got a 6. So first round of combat, air combat's over. These guys hang around for the second round. So now they'll target the other 110. Same process, and now the Russians have got a 6 and the Germans have got a 4. So on the second round of combat, the Russians have missed and the Germans have got a 4, which was enough because their target was a 5, so it's below, so it's a hit and abort. And that's the end of the air combat. Now we go on to the ground combat. So we've got our 14 plus the 10 is 24. And so on 3 to 1. Again, a quick look at the CRT. On the 3 to 1 column, we've got a +1 for air superiority, because there's no Russians left. You have to have at least 2 strength. It's a D8 system, and that's actually a 5. So 5 plus 1 is a 6 at 3 to 1, which is a 3-star or 3-circle result. So that's 3 steps. If you do at least half or more of the defending steps, so there's a chance the defender must retreat. And if his die roll matches or exceeds the result that caused the damage, they have to retreat. So the result was a 6, and we've got a 7. So these guys must retreat. So they'll go here. Now, if the attackers want to advance, then because the hex was vacated, but that wasn't achieved with a defender eliminated result, they've got to take a step loss if they want to advance. But I think that's worth doing. That concludes the breakthrough combat. Air units return to base, and these guys are currently committed during the current offensive, so they fly back, and that's our breakthrough combat done. Now we do other movement where everything else can move. What I do with the breakthrough guys, I rotate these so I know they can't be moved again. These guys can now move, and after movement actually the HQs can move 3 more hexes and activate further units. But there's no need to in this example. So now we're on to the combat phase. Very similar situation, but now all these guys can attack. Had these guys not have cleared the target from the breakthrough attack, their only option in normal combat would be to have attacked that same target hex. The fact they were able to advance means that they are relieved of that commitment, and they can now join in the attack on Voronezh. So Voronezh has got a strength of 8 plus 2 for the leaders, 10, and then we've got 2 12s and a 16, so that's 40. That's right, yes, 40, 50, 55, 59 against 10, which is enough for 5 to 1, which is the top column. In terms of modifiers, we would just fly in some aircraft, doesn't matter which one it is, as long as there is air superiority in the hex. So we don't need it to bump the odds up, but we do need it for the die roll modifier. The Russians here would not take up the option to intercept because they're both flipped, and if they were hit again they would be destroyed, and they want to wait to end of the month to do pilot recovery. So we're 5 to 1, concentric attack, +1. Then we've got a +1 for the air, and Russian cities in Russia give them a -1 modifier. So we're a net +1 attack on the top column, and we've got a 4. Oops, that's the 4. So 4 plus 1's 5 is a DE. So these guys die. We have to check for the leader, Either one or two may die. He survives, so he goes to the force pool, and he'll be able to be reassigned in the next seasonal phase. These guys can advance after combat, and they don't need to take a hit because the hex was cleared with a defender eliminated. Now, just for the fun of it, just to show you an example, if there was a leader on this stack here, if these cleared the hex, these would be eligible for an exploitation. So you would mark that with an exploitation. With anything else that had had a successful attack, so any armoured stack with a leader, you must have leaders for exploitation as opposed to breakthrough when it's just armoured forces. So these guys could move in, or they could stay where they are. These guys would move in, so not with the river. Then you can do what's called a secondary advance, so anything which was activated as part of the same offensive could move in and fill the gap. Then we've finished our normal combat. Again, the air returns. That should be currently committed, as were the fighters. You don't commit the Russian ones because they're supporting Russians which have not yet been activated. So these could theoretically activate on a future Russian offensive. So that's where we are. Then we can do exploitation combat. And so we've got 16, 19 to 8 is 2 to 1. 1, 2, 3, 4. We've got our long range fighters. So what would happen here is they might put in some air just to bump up the odds a bit. So we're on 16, 19, 25, and they'll fly in 28 and the 4 for 32, so that would be 4 to 1. I think the Russians would probably decline to intercept given that both of their air units are depleted. So we managed to get a 4 to 1 attack with a +1 for the air superiority. It's a 3, which becomes a 4, which is a 2-step. They might flip them both actually. Try and keep the stuff on the map. The two that were in Voronezh and that were killed, they can go into the replenishment pool, and the Russians get 4 of these back, free each monthly turn at the end of the month if they died on Russian home territory. So those would go in the replenishment deck and would come back to be placed in a non-ZOC hex. So these guys got a 4, there was 2 losses. They'd roll the dice to see if they have to retreat, because we've managed to get half or more losses in the hex, and we got a 2. So that's lower than the target of 4. So the Russians don't lose that hex. That's the end of exploitation. And that is a typical combat. Air units return to the bases. If these activated units are attacked themselves later on, then these air can fly in the defence of aircraft these air can fly in defence of the ground units that were previously activated, because these are currently committed. What they couldn't do is fly in defence of some other units up here which hadn't yet been activated. So that takes you through a typical land combat. Once you finish land combat, then you do all the other offensives, and then at the end of all the offensives, units that weren't activated can move. You get to do some rail movement. You get a second naval movement for the task forces and naval units. You check your supply, then you have a replenishment step where the Russians could bring back some of these guys that had been killed earlier to maybe fill some gaps, and if they had some economic points, they could pay for pilot recovery. So that would be 4 each. So going into the next month of the season, we've got a German flipped bomber, but the Russian fighters are back to full strength, so all to play for next month. So there you go. Hopefully that gives you an idea of how the flow of a typical game turn goes.